Hi, my name is Caitlin Blanchfield. I'm here to share some outcomes of my PhD research that's into the history of urban planning, scientific research, and land claims in Inuvik and the larger Gwich'in settlement region. I recently completed my PhD dissertation at Columbia University in New York. And for my dissertation, I looked at how architecture is part of government efforts to settle and colonize indigenous lands and resources, and also at how colonization has been contested by communities through their relationships to land and to the built environment. So I'll be showing some of my research findings in this video. And if you have any questions or would like to read more of my work or have any comments of things that I should include in this research in the future, I'll share my contact information in the comments at the end, as well as in the next slide of the presentation. So again, the title of my dissertation is Unsettling Colonial Science, Modern Architecture, and Indigenous Claims to Land in North America and the Pacific. My degree is from Columbia University, and I have my email address here if anyone has questions. So this research project looked at government-funded research facilities and infrastructures that were built from the 1950s to the 1990s to explain how the pursuit of scientific knowledge during this time, the Cold War era, contributed to the settlement of landscapes that the government had seen as difficult to access or as hard to develop, and that this was done through practices of modernism and modernization. So for me, modernism took shape in architectural design, urban planning, and land use planning. And I focused on 3 sites: the Kitt Peak National Observatory on the Tohono O'odham Nation, shown here, the Mauna Kea observatories in Hawaii, here, and the Inuvik Research Lab, here, which I'll be talking about. So in the chapter of my dissertation that looked at the Inuvik Research Lab, I looked at the design and construction of the lab as part of the design and construction of the entire town of Inuvik, and the relocation of many residents from Aklavik that was part of that process. So I was curious what the relationship between the lab and the larger town revealed about the development of the Northwest Territories for national security or military, as well as resource extraction. And then secondly, I wanted to know how land claim negotiations responded to the government desire to develop Northern resources. So kind of looking from time in the 1950s, where a lot of this government effort to administer the North begins to happen, through the end of the land claims process that was intended to bring sovereignty back and control of the lands back. So I spent several weeks looking at the archives in the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Center in Yellowknife, the Canadian Library and Archives in Ottawa, and the Aurora Research Institute's library, as well as the public library in Inuvik. I also interviewed Gwich'in elders and current leaders about their role in the construction of Inuvik, the negotiation of the land claims, and just general memories from that time, as well as the current implementation of the land claims and the organizing of the Gwich'in government. I also spent time in Inuvik, just walking around in the city to understand what it's like, as well as in Fort McPherson. And so you can also see an image of me and my son, who came with me, about to go to the Muskrat Jamboree. And so the transcripts and recordings of my interviews will be archived with the Gwich'in Tribal Council and Department of Culture and Heritage. So I'm sure many watching will be familiar with the history of Inuvik from personal and family experiences and stories. So in brief, the idea was created by the Department of Northern Affairs and National Development in 1953. And Inuvik was originally called E3, the third of 9 proposed sites, both to the east and the west of Aklavik, so E for east. And we can see this kind of rough sketch of the town plan in the Aklavik Journal. Northern Affairs had decided to move Aklavik so they could build an expanded new town as an administrative and infrastructural center for the Western Arctic. And that at the time, the federal government considered knowledge and control over the region important for military purposes, such as the distant early warning line in Tuk, for example, and the growing oil and gas industry. Some of the first two buildings in Inuvik were for the Navy as well as the RCMP. And then subsequent buildings such as airports and the airport, the hospital, and the residential schools or the hostels also came soon after. The research lab was also included in early plans for the town, though it was not completed until 1964. But more than just a site to expand or to solve the problem of flooding that was present in Aklavik, E3 was also supposed to be a modernist planned town. And so when I was reading government reports and newspaper articles from the time, this term modern came up quite a bit. And it meant an approach to urban planning and to infrastructure building, as well as to building of homes and built government buildings. And these modern approaches were said to be coming from southern cities to transform northern landscapes and people. And so one newspaper headline from the Edmonton Journal makes this kind of bias clear, and this actual lack of knowledge about the land and the landscape and how to live and work in it that these government officials were bringing with them when it says, a 20th century community has started to rise from the Arctic wastes, some 1,500 miles northwest of Edmonton. So some of the elements of Inuvik's planning that these, construction firms, government agencies, etc., were talking about when they were talking about the modern was the use of prefabricated buildings, technological approaches to design and engineering using pile drivers and gravel for construction and permafrost, and utilities in the well-known utilidors. But they were also referring to the industrial development of the northern economy, the introduction of government and wage labor. And given the importance to the community of the military's presence in the Arctic, historians have called this form of modernization military modernization. And so one of the things that I'm arguing is that the scientific research facility is part of this process of military modernization. What's revealed, though, in reading the records of the construction of Inuvik was also that the town was seen as a kind of experiment, because despite a lot of these reports being very confident about their knowledge of how to build in the Arctic, often bureaucrats and firms coming up from Edmonton actually didn't have any knowledge in how to build in the permafrost or how to work with materials in it. So before the lab was even built, construction in the permafrost and the creation of the utilidor system was actually written about in scientific journals as the form of scientific research that Inuvik would enable, and that this was a prototype for similar communities that would then be created across the Western Arctic. And as Gwich'in historian from Inuvik, Crystal Fraser writes, the town was also seen as a social experiment, and the research lab hosted social scientists like anthropologists and sociologists as well. This social experiment can also be seen in the way that the town was divided and segregated during its early years, where white administrators lived on one end of town and Gwich'in, Inuvialuit, and Métis families lived on the other in the 512 units, which were smaller than government-provided houses and did not have access to utilidors when they were initially built. which introduced colonial ideas about social classification and racial classification. But talking with people who worked on the initial construction of Inuvik's buildings, what I saw was that the knowledge of local people made the town possible. So innovative construction techniques with timber on buildings made them withstand weather and last in good condition for a long time, which was the knowledge of actual construction workers. And so, even today, many 512s are still in use. And the production of materials, particularly lumber, required local knowledge of the land and skills in harvesting to make it available. Maintenance and ongoing care for buildings also required the expertise and experience of local residents and those who are coming from surrounding communities to work in Inuvik, as well as their initiative to keep machines running and, for example, school children warm during the cold months. Often in histories, cities are really at the center, and the lands surrounding them are seen as secondary and only important because of the resources they provide for these urban areas. And this is particularly true in my field of architecture. So these conversations with people who moved to and built Inuvik show that the town did not become more important or more central than the land and the bush and the camps and rivers and lakes and animals. These remain primary activities and places where people spent time. And Inuvik became one site in a constellation of places that people traveled between and made their living in. And we're still all over the country for different jobs, family, trapping, and fishing, and brought this into town too, for example, still setting nets in the Mackenzie River. And this was a very different mindset from Inuvik planners who viewed the landscape, as I mentioned before, as a challenge to be overcome by urbanization, as a difficult place to access, to build, to live in. At the same time, the design of the town and the services it provided also intentionally kept people in the community, disrupting patterns of living on their land, such as through the schooling system. So zooming in on the Inuvik Research Lab, which is now the Western Arctic Research Center on Mackenzie Avenue. The original building was built in 1964 and offered lab space, lodging, equipment for scientists, and storage facilities, meeting rooms, and a library. And during its first 20 years, it was operated by the federal government. And at that time, much of the research done was geological and biological, really around permafrost, how it forms, how it behaves, and how to build on it. Government and oil and gas industry scientists also collaborated on projects such as the Northern Oil and Gas Action Plan, or NOGAP, in the 1970s. One program I was particularly interested in, though, from my reading of many of the documents coming out of this lab, was community initiated and involved concerned community members from Inuvik and concerned scientists working at the lab. And it was called the Mackenzie Institute. The institute was started by individuals who would go on to create political groups like COPE and the Delta Community Action Program. A few of them were John Pascal, Elijah Manerick, Agnes Semler, as well as Dick Hill, who directed the lab, and Ian Butters, who ran the newspaper. And at first, the Mackenzie Institute served as a kind of community college, offering language classes in embroidery, math, government studies, and more. But as the Institute's reach grew, it became increasingly focused on questions of environmental protection and Indigenous rights to determine what happens on the land. Many environmental scientists shared the concerns of Inuvialuit and Gwich'in community members about the effects of oil and gas exploration on plants, animals, rivers, and lakes. So the Institute group collected their own data on the actions of oil and gas companies operating in the Mackenzie Delta And they distributed also data collected by their collaborators at the lab, the scientists, to the community. So really opening up the lab and also directing what kind of data was being collected and what it was for and who it was for. One event that the Mackenzie Institute participated in that stood out to me and that I wrote about in my dissertation was a conference on Northern development co-hosted by the Mackenzie Institute and the Arctic Institute of North America. And this was called the Man in the North Conference on Community Development. Attendees came mainly from Gwich'in, Fort McPherson, Inuvik, Tuktoyaktuk, as well as other communities in the Northwest Territories and Yukon. And so Gwich'in and Inuvialuit organizers and attendees actually intervened in the conference program. So people from the Arctic Institute who were like government policy people and researchers from McGill University in sociology and anthropology had kind of set up this program of this 2 to 3 day long conference that would take place in Inuvik and invited these participants from communities nearby. But they actually proposed and made changes to this program to put forward topics that they felt like were very important. So they mandated sessions that would be conducted in Gwich'in and Inuvialuit language instead of only in English. And they also asked or really demanded that some of the sessions be instead turned over and changed to be sessions that would talk about self-determination and the land. And so by doing this, I argue in the dissertation that they really transformed the space of the research lab and the conference center. And again, what these kinds of organizations are doing and who they're serving, and changed the terms on which rights to the land and concerns over development were talked about. The Mackenzie Institute is such an interesting historical event because it showed how these spaces and places that were designed with colonial intention, so to establish government presence in the North and open up the land for resource extraction, were reshaped and used differently than intended, whether that's at the scale of this one building or at the town, the whole institution, and what it means for the land. And so I think these forms of use and placemaking that redirected certain colonial spaces and opened up forums for dialogue helped to lay the groundwork for the negotiations of the land claims in the decades that followed. For example, delegates at the Man in the North conference like Edward Nazone and Phoebe Nahani were later involved in the Dene mapping project and the mapping of Gwich'in trails and trap lines, specifically shown in this image on the right of an annotated map and trapper biography. And then on the left of the entire map mosaic that was used in the land claim. And this was an innovative kind of form, not only of cartography, but also of data collection that they developed. And so my interest in the land claim was how territory was contested through understandings of land use and environment that we could see, germinating and being contested in the spaces like the conference a couple decades earlier. So in talking to people who were involved in the land claims, I learned how the Canadian government had used techniques of land classification and zoning the same way it had zoned Inuvik, segregating the town, tried to zone the land into the most important areas, the second most important areas, third most important areas, to retain control over Gwich'in lands during the negotiations. Federal negotiators understood most of the lands to be crown lands. And so they used this idea of government ownership and quote unquote public access to resources to try to retain control. They also approached land value in terms of what the land would be worth for extractive industry to sell rights to do oil and gas exploration, instead of the value of the sustainability of plants, animals, lands, and waters, and the importance of sustaining the ability to harvest for future generations. So by classifying lands into zones of A, B, C, limiting the amount of land negotiators could select in each category, and divvying selected land into surface and subsurface rights, settlement area, primary and secondary use area, the government aimed to break up and limit Gwich'in control over territory, even as they were, relinquishing it, and the land claims were kind of forcing them to give Gwich'in and other indigenous governments authority over their own lands. They still did not want to give up that in a total way. But Gwich'in negotiators, I learned, navigated this process and used their own knowledge of the land and history of land use to select the best areas for hunting and harvesting. And these are images of actual maps that were used to select different parcels for harvesting areas or to have as private Gwich'in lands within the larger land claim. And so they also use classifications such as traditional lands and harvesting areas and private lands to expand the amount of land that they would have control and sovereignty over. And while the government also hoped to take advantage of the disagreements between land claims groups when it came to overlap, such as with Inuvik or lands in the Yukon, particularly with the Yukon, negotiators understood this tactic and therefore prioritized reaching agreements on the overlaps. In conclusion, by focusing on one modern scientific research laboratory, I was able to see how colonial approaches to spatial planning and building, extractive forms of knowledge, and development were used to open up Gwich'in lands to industry and federal control from the 1950s to 70s. And yet by learning from those who built and moved through these spaces, it became clear that colonial ways of planning and researching were contested over the course of decades to prioritize Gwich'in knowledge of landscape and the environment. And it was precisely this knowledge of the land and history of land use that was necessary and mobilized to transform spaces and buildings like the research lab, or to open up places for political organizing within the community of Inuvik. And that was definitely necessary coming into negotiations with the federal government over land claims to achieve protecting Gwich'in lands and habitats and retaining sovereignty. So thank you so much for listening to this video, and please do get in touch with me if you would like to read my dissertation, ask any questions, or just provide me with any information that you think would be helpful to add.